Hey, happy Friday. As you saw on the thumbnail, today we are discussing The Late Americans by Brandon Taylor, the book in which I may have finally figured out tabbies. I mean, not really. It's a personal system, but I like that they're kind of like color-coded to the cover on this one. But I was getting on the train the other day for my morning commute, had my book out, and as I was moving back to a free seat, I saw a woman reading Beautiful World, Where Are You? So she was reading this, I was reading this, and it was just like one of those moments that felt kind of perfect. I mean, obviously, people are reading on the train every day. People are reading a variety of books on the train every day. I was sitting next to a woman a week or so ago reading Yellowface, and it took everything in me not to talk to her about it because I had started it, but I haven't finished it yet just because of library loans. But this felt right to me because, for one, if you watched my review Feature Friday on Beautiful World, Where Are You? You know that I talk about the Brandon Taylor review of Beautiful World, Where Are You? Within that video. And now, having read The Late Americans, they feel in a similar world. They're not by any means the same book, and they're not necessarily exploring exactly the same things, but they are both exploring this idea of being an artist or a young person in the world, or this idea of community and what community looks like now, and both feel like they take place in a kind of similar liminal space in some ways, or at least a mental liminal space. We don't necessarily see a physical representation of that, except in The Late Americans we kind of do, because college, in whatever way most of these characters are in graduate school, is a kind of liminal space where you're kind of cocooned and figuring out who you are. College is where I found out about the concept of liminal spaces, period, personally. So it is kind of exploring that. Now, Beautiful World, Where Are You? Follows characters more specifically. We do have a great group of characters in The Late Americans that are kind of weaving in and out of each other's lives. And in some ways it feels like a kind of combination thematically and narratively of Real Life and Filthy Animals, Brandon Taylor's previous works, because it does have this real element of realism, but it is also kind of this weaving, as I mentioned. We've got all of these characters and we're focused on different people at different times, and it almost feels like a group of interconnected short stories. Now, because it is a novel, this is not the first, nor will it be the last time we see a group of something as a reader feels like an experience of a group of short stories framed as a novel. And I think that it's an important exploration of kind of narrative structure in some ways, because granted, I have not been to grad school, so I haven't explored the kind of thematic depths of the craft in some of the ways that it feels like you almost kind of need to discuss this, and not need to, but it feels like I would have more to offer and would be more articulate in my thoughts. But I think that the kind of less articulate thoughts are also valuable because it's my experience as a reader. And all of these experiences are going to be different because I found very mixed reviews for this book. I found a lot of people kind of saying it was pretentious, and I'm going to kind of pick at that idea later, and you are of course allowed to have your opinions on things, absolutely. But I personally didn't find it pretentious, and I think that there's a few reasons. However, I think that the structure of it is going to be a stumbling block for some readers because you go in expecting a kind of Aristotelian model. And I've kind of talked about this in passing in previous videos and how I'm kind of becoming aware, and I've credited this awareness most specifically to reading Bestiary by K-Ming Chang, but this idea of the Aristotelian model being the kind of prominent, or preeminent, I should say, storytelling mode, and it's the default, it's what we learn in school, and we kind of judge a work's value based on our ability to frame it by the Aristotelian structure. However, this discredits a lot of other storytelling structures. But if you're a reader going in expecting the Aristotelian model, then you may be frustrated because you don't feel like you're going anywhere. However, this is a much different structure. I don't know that I would call it circular necessarily, which is, I think, how non-Aristotelian structure was presented to be in high school. However, the presentation of non-Aristotelian structure in high school led to us reading my least favorite assigned reading I've ever read, which was Dandelion Wine by Ray Bradbury. I've been tempted to revisit it as an adult and see if I have a different experience because at the time I was very rooted in the Aristotelian model, right? However, at the same time, I think the best instances in the modern reading experience of non-Aristotelian structure are coming from authors really digging into non-Western modes of storytelling. However, I'm not necessarily commenting on this book in any way in relation to that at the moment, just that the structure is a lot more fluid and the climaxes, we're not leading to like one major climax, right? But we are exploring all of these characters on the precipice of moving into real life, whatever that may be, and how they are managing their lives on the precipice of entering the real world, what the real world looks like today, what art looks like today. This book also breaks a lot of the rules I have for myself in terms of plays that I've mentioned. And rules is a strong word, but you may have heard me talk before about how as a dramaturg, a literary manager in the theater space, and granted, I haven't been really active in that space the last couple of years. That's potentially a wider conversation that is kind of tapped into in this book a little bit in relation to art and this idea of struggling for your art and what art is valid and how you live in relation to art and how money plays into all of that. All of that is explored thematically in this book for sure. But with that, we have this idea of following artists, much in the way that we did in Filthy Animals. I can definitely see the germs of this in Filthy Animals with the connected stories there. We're looking at a different group, but it feels like this novel may have grown from that. I don't know the genesis of it. However, with plays, I've notoriously said I'm tired of theater about and for theater people. That is a little bit because of it feels very insular, like who are we talking to? Are we kind of welcoming more people in with this art? Are we telling a story? Or are we just kind of sitting around in our small group talking to ourselves? And then with that, of course, as well, the concept of realism, which I've talked about as I'm tired of kind of like family kitchen table dramas. I think approaching realism from a different kind of point of view, like Taylor does, is what I'm interested in, because these moments feel like I can feel the beats of them. So we have the prose kind of linking everything, right? And I think the prose is where some people may feel that the novel kind of veers toward pretension, because it really is kind of picking at a lot of these big ideas, right? And these characters are picking at a lot of these big ideas in the same way. It doesn't really go into pretentious for me personally, because I do love the language and the style of language, and I like the ideas being picked at. It may come down to too. And I think that some of that criticism in terms of pretension may also be a sticking point, because if you're expecting that kind of normal Aristotelian structure, you feel like we're just kind of wallowing in these thoughts, when really the kind of circular nature of that, I think, is the thing. We're all kind of germinating with these characters together, but also experiencing and revealing the full breadth of these characters. Because I also think what this novel does so well is it explores this community, town and the gown, in this college atmosphere. This was clearly born of the Iowa Writers Workshop, which is one of the preeminent writing programs that I think even as someone outside of the writer community, there is an awareness of, or at least I have an awareness of. But having been in a college town, because, you know, I went to college, but I also spent a summer doing ethnographic research in Muncie, Indiana, because the theater department and the sociology department were pairing to kind of do an updated play exploring the idea of Middletown, which was a really kind of seminal sociology study that has been critiqued for valid reasons as well, but then had an update documentary series in, oh, I forget the decade. It's been a decade since I did this. And then we were kind of re-exploring that in the age of deindustrialization. And so that got me into the town a little bit more than I may have interacted with it as just a normal college student. And so this book explores kind of the blending and the bleeding of those two worlds, and it presents all of its characters in this really dynamic way. They are all incredibly sympathetic, even when they are people that you may not like in real life. We are exploring their flaws and the things that make them sympathetic, the things that make them more relatable as well. But then we'll go to another chapter from a different character's perspective and experience different characters in a new way. There are some characters that are only experienced secondhand, but show up in multiple stories, and we're able to get a more complete picture of them through that. And it also continues this idea idea of writing about the Midwest that I've always really enjoyed from Taylor and talked about enjoying from Taylor. And it really amps that up in a way, I think, because it presents more of a wide picture. We see kind of where people just going about their day-to-day lives are kind of over the thought exercises from these students and how it feels so irrelevant to their day-to-day lives in a lot of ways, and the kind of struggle of just surviving and the conflict between the struggle to just survive and like this pursuit of arts. Like I've said, money is explored a lot in terms of what students particularly have money, where it comes from, if they've had money generationally, or if it's new, if it's been lost, who has to work for their studies, how that shapes your point of view, and especially your point of view around art, kind of circling back to this idea of suffering for art. If you have been through an art program in any way, I experienced this as an undergrad. I have read poets who have mentioned similar things being said in their programs. There is this idea put out that if you could do anything else and be happy, do that. Which, as I've gotten older, I understand the impetus of. It feels honest in the moment. It feels like you're warning people at the kind of precipice of a new life, what they're getting into. But as I've gotten older, gained more perspective and life experience, I actually have a lot of criticism of that thought process, because when you are on that precipice, you will do anything for your art. You feel like that is all possible, and that is also then presented as a challenge. This idea that you are going to prove that you have what it takes and what that may cost in the long run, regardless of what that may cost in the long run. And we see some of that cost in this book from like a larger industry critique, I would say, in this moment. So sorry for the tangent. This idea that you have to suffer for your art. And so you are priming people for exploitation for the sake of their love of the thing. The best advice I got in college, well, I've gotten a couple of pieces of great advice. The first one was to not go right to grad school, and another one was to not work for free. Now, has that limited what I am doing in the theater space? Absolutely. But I think it's also protected me in a lot of ways. Now, that doesn't mean that I've not taken jobs where my output exceeded the pay, but that's the kind of balance, and a lot of that is what is being explored here. Now, with that, there is the possible critique that I am part of the target audience for this, which is completely valid and something to consider. But I love how it is exploring those ideas. We're watching the characters grapple with those ideas, but we are also invited into the critique of it from the beginning, because we open with the character Seamus in a poetry seminar, and it's kind of set up to critique the kind of self-importance of some of the ways we talk about work in these seminars. And I frequently battle with this idea of how am I talking about a work, and is it actually getting to the heart of a thing, or is it actually exploring the thing, or is it just being kind of verbose for the sake of being verbose? And I think that that's a really difficult kind of thing to pick at. It's a difficult idea to kind of unpack. But we then start to see a kind of more unkind view of this character, where he has some flaws. The fact that he is a white man, seemingly in this protected space, like writing critique circles are this very vulnerable open space. And he's critiquing the work of his colleagues that are mainly women and criticizing their poetry about themselves or exploring their trauma. But we come to find out later in the book that he's really suppressing a lot of his own trauma. And so as a reader, I was going through a lot of different kind of waves with this character, because at first I was like, okay, this is an interesting kind of takedown of the kind of like writing community at this level. It's kind of complicating the perceived pretentiousness in a lot of ways. And then I'm like, oh, this is not a sympathetic character. This is the guy in your class that you really want to punch in the face but can't, because you can't just go around punching people in the face. But then we complicate it further. And we see this with a lot of the characters, and especially the characters that are in relationships that span life experience, particularly with Theodore. And apologies, I read this, I didn't listen to the audiobook, so I may be pronouncing some of these names incorrectly, who works in a meat processing plant. And Timo, his boyfriend, who is at the college and is judging him a lot of the times for his job. And Theodore feels caught. He's like, this is my life. I can't change it. This is what I do. This is who I am, and felt like he wasn't getting enough sympathy, or he was being attacked in his own space in a way where he just had a long day on his feet all day working. And so it really explores a lot of these dynamics, and it presents a full scope of these people. One of the pieces of Theodore I found the most engaging is he has broken up with Timo at one point in the book, kind of spoiler, I guess, but you know, in the first chapter, when we kind of meet Fyodor and one of his friends at the bar with Seamus, kind of one of the things that weaves us in and out, that's what they're discussing. And the narrative is talking to us about how he is not the best reader, he's a slow reader, and he feels really judged by Timo about that, this idea that it takes him longer, but we still see him engaging with stories. And I love this idea of really presenting art and how different people engage with art. And there is still kind of a high level to the way some of these characters are talking about art and talking about how they engage with art, even outside of their own artistic disciplines. But it was a way to explore kind of the human condition and how that is universal. This exploration of the human condition is universal across experience, and it isn't limited to this higher education bubble. And it's really complicating the views of a lot of these students. And along with this too, as I shuffle so my leg doesn't fall asleep, except spoiler alert, it's already asleep, we are kind of reflecting in my experience, or in my reading experience, it really feels like it is drawing on a kind of 19th century novel kind of idea of exploration in that way. Now, it's not nearly as long, it's much more succinct, which is another reason I don't think that the novel really reads as pretentious to me, because it doesn't feel like we are getting lost in these verbose ideas. It feels like they're all well-intentioned and really succinctly delivered. And so kind of moving into this 19th century novel idea, which I find interesting for a couple of different reasons. The first, in the first chapter, and again, I think introducing the book through the concept of this critique seminar invites us into a conversation with the work and a conversation with art in general. And one of the things the poet we are closest to, Seamus, engages with in his own poetry is this idea of pulling on older modes of storytelling to kind of help represent the now, or this idea of being able to scratch at bigger ideas through this older form of storytelling. Now, there's a lot to unpack with this in terms of the character there too. So I'm not saying that this is like an invitation across the board for how we as readers are being asked to approach the text or invited into this world necessarily, but I think they are in very interesting conversation with each other, because I do kind of view this as not a pastoral by any means, but this kind of return to looking at a full community in a novel and getting a real sense of place and time and people through this community. And one of the ways I have been able to kind of frame this is through Taylor's Twitter, of all things, because he talks about like Henry James and Jane Austen and all of these authors so often. I know he has this deep understanding of them. Now, granted, I personally have not read any Henry James. That's a lie. I've read Turn of the Screw, but that feels a lot different to me personally than other books like Daisy Miller and The Portrait of a Lady that he is also most popular for. Now, granted, I haven't read them, so you have to take that with so many grains of salt, but it feels like we are kind of returning to this community approach. I think most directly of something like Middlemarch, where we do have these kind of deep character studies. We see the way that their lives weave in and out of each other, and it's this kind of more languid, reflective thing in many ways. And I'm getting that here, though a much more succinct languid, whether for Taylor's own style or for our decreased attention spans, I cannot say for certain. Now, shifting gears slightly in terms of how Taylor's Twitter kind of helped inform my reading of this, which just speaks to an extra level of kind of context, I think, because I think the book reads on its own. I think all of these ideas are here, particularly through that framing in the first chapter from Seamus, and that idea of how he is approaching work, and then that making us think more critically about how we're approaching the work and the characters here as well in a lot of ways, whether we are actively thinking about engaging with it critically or not, because it can be a more passive experience, but I think it's still happening in the subconscious on some level. Now, I debated whether I was going to talk about this piece because Taylor's work speaks for itself, but now having read the book, this piece makes me even angrier. This piece being, when this book was released, a Slate article was circulating, particularly on Twitter, and it was not a generous read, and on many levels I wonder it was purely clickbait, but the author of this Slate article was reviewing the book, and this is where I have the most problems with it, I think, because it was framed as a book review, but it was very biased, because the author of the article presents Taylor's Twitter persona before it starts actively engaging with this work, and so it is showing his Twitter persona. He has a very popular Twitter, he is great at Twitter, but he has a much different tone on Twitter than this book is. If you have read his other work, you recognize this tone. I don't remember if this article actually said if she's read any of Taylor's other work or not, but based on the writing of this article, I'm going to go with no, because this book really feels like part and parcel of the existing body of work as we have it. And it actually feels in conversation with both of those pieces, as I said, in really interesting ways. And they're all exploring very interesting similar themes. However, she is then judging this work in a derogatory way based on the fact that it wasn't what she was expecting from him based on that Twitter persona, or it wasn't what she wanted. And this is one of the more ungenerous reads, I think. Is there a readership eager for fiction that catalogs every fiber of the despair and ambivalence in mundane interactions? Probably. Does it extend much beyond the members and alumni of MFA programs? Doubtful. It may be possible to write a novel about people slogging through directionless lives without the novel becoming a slog itself, but Taylor hasn't done that. As a reader, I don't know why anyone would even want to. This type of fiction aspires to realism, and reality does indeed include some brooding and wheel spinning, but in contrast to Taylor's less formal online writing, the stuff often dismissed as a form of self-promotion or marketing, his fiction feels stunted, as if the full range of Taylor's own experience has been narrowed to fit the Iowa workshop mold. I found this very interesting, in addition to rage-inducing, because we're kind of picking at this in this segment, this idea of pretentiousness in a lot of ways. One, there is a readership for it. Hi, hello, I am the readership. And while similar conversations and critiques have been lobbied against authors like Sally Rooney that are playing in similar thematic landscapes, it isn't bringing up what the reader expected her to write about, right? It's engaging with the work on its own merit. And two, there is this kind of constant refrain of pretension in this article in particular. And I actually found the framing of some of the takedown of this novel more pretentious than the novel itself. Now, yes, is there some language that might get labeled purple by people really expecting this plot-driven, forward-focused kind of novel, kind of sequence? Sure. But I don't think it's as self-indulgent as this author is saying. In fact, I find this author's article a lot more self-indulgent than the text itself. Now, granted, you may not. You may find the text self-indulgent, that's fine. Where I have trouble with this article is that we are framing it around this idea that an artist needs to have the same tone to their art and their personality in different ways. This idea that the performance of public persona somehow is a reflection then on your art and what your art should be doing. I think there are tons of valid critiques to be had about places like the Iowa Workshop. I think this book is engaged with a lot of those valid critiques, but this author didn't want to engage authentically with the text. And I struggle with this too. I try to be aware, and I talk about this struggle of approaching the thing on its own merit versus how you responded to the thing. And your own response is always valid. I am bringing my own response to things every video, but I really try to frame things as to why I'm responding this way, or if I can't kind of firmly grasp why I'm responding a certain way, presenting it, reminding that there's an opinion there. Now, this isn't to me a lack of self-confidence in my opinions, but a recognition that experiences are vast, responses are vast, the whole kind of gamut. I also have problems with this kind of framing of every character has a past trauma they are either flaunting or hiding. This feels like loaded language to me when this book is so interested in exploring the deep kind of layers of a person, this kind of psychological exploration, and most people do have traumas they're either hiding or flaunting. Like, that's just an aspect of humanity, I think. And so I think the way that's framed just kind of reads disingenuous, like this whole article, but there's something more there that just feels a little icky to me. I'm not gonna lie. This idea that people are talking about their trauma for some kind of perceived clout, which I think that the book explores when that may be the case, but when it's not, and how all of that shapes a person and how they react to things, how all of the unseen of a person can shape things, and it makes you really interrogate people and how you respond to people based on their outward actions, going back to that character at the beginning when I was kind of like, oh, okay, I'm kind of understanding his thought process, and at the same time recognizing if I was in that class with him where he was constantly degrading and picking apart everyone's work while never submitting any of his own, I would not like him at all. And so it is exploring this full kind of breadth of a thing, and we can't just ignore the bad in that breadth, but I don't think that Taylor really presents too much judgment. It's this kind of like knowing, it's this kind of like sly wink in a way that is like, this is life. How are we exploring this? And it's also exploring the kind of interaction between generations. So yeah, I don't want to talk about that article too long because I don't want to overshadow the work and I don't want that to be the context for the work. But it just made me really angry, particularly because I think too, she talks about his Twitter so much and how what she expected based on his Twitter, but then didn't even see the ways that a lot of the art that Taylor engages with or talks about in Twitter is so clear and evident in this book. And again, I am just barely able to like kind of see the surface of the thing. There's a whole foundation there that I'm not smart enough to see, but the foundation is laid so expertly that I can appreciate what I am seeing. And I don't think you have to have the full breadth. You can experience and appreciate the pieces you're given. Now, does this mean if you're wrong, if you don't experience the pieces you're given? Absolutely not. And I think I would be less mad too if the article had been a little bit more honest about, oh, I was coming in with these expectations and biases based on this, but this is what we got instead, and engaged with that in a less sanctimonious way. I don't know. I anticipate this book is probably going to be pretty divisive. Now, for people who have read Taylor's work before, I don't know that it's a huge surprise, but I am really interested in the thoughts around this book, whether you've read Taylor's work prior, before, or not. And if this is the first book you've picked up, I'm really interested in how you came to pick this one up and whether you're interested in going and reading some of his earlier work. But let me know what you're thinking about all of this. Thanks as always for hanging out and listening to my thoughts. Like, subscribe, comment, whatever you're feeling in the moment. Read something good most importantly, and yeah, bye.